When reviewing and looking back at everything we've discussed this semester, my natural response is to be overwhelmed. We've looked at and covered so many different topics, different forms of sanctions of punishments, philosophical responses to wrongdoings, historical context, and so much more. Each and every one of these different topics, like dungeons, monastery cells, hulks, capital punishment, just to name a few, each have their own corresponding philosophical approaches that motivated their creation and use. So let's dive right in and begin looking at a few different approaches to wrongdoing so we can begin to answer the question of how should society respond to criminal wrongdoing. I believe society's response to wrongdoing should utilize principles of restorative justice. Lords built their castles atop lofty hills and mountain peaks so they could watch their enemies ride up to meet them. Inside these castles, the use of dungeons and holding cells quickly became more and more popular so the lords could keep their political rivals or any other enemies safely put away. The conditions inside the dungeons were terrible. They were extremely small, void of light, with walls that pressed inwards to create a sense of claustrophobia. The stone and mortar construction was purposely built to be unkind and harsh to the person kept inside. These cells were built for isolation. Back then, they were feudal states, meaning that they lacked well-defined borders like maps of today. They were grounds without authority because the king was unable to rule individually over every aspect of the land, so the lords had to take matters into their own hands and built their castles as strongholds and fortresses. Thus, the use of dungeons and holding cells quickly became more and more popular. They were born out of paranoia of keeping the lord's political rivals out of their way. This was all because justice was served on a case-by-case basis by each lord. Dungeons were small, cramped, crowded, filled with the decayed corpses of others, human waste, and disease. They were terrible places meant to make people disappear. This process of removing someone from the world without leaving behind a body was an incredibly smart and evil trick because it created a sense of awe and fear around the Lord. Someone's absence could be interpreted as questioning whether that person was a secret agent the entire time, if they're being tortured, killed, etc. Not knowing was the worst part for the people on the outside. For the people on the inside, they were even worse. They were served to break the person's body, mind, spirit, and well-being. Dungeons were an extrajudicial process, meaning the justification behind internment in these dungeons did not always have to be substantial or even exist for that matter. Someone could find themselves in the dungeon because they offended the Lord, and that was really not a clear path to the dungeons. While there could be an argument made for different approaches to wrongdoing, I believe that dungeons were retributivist in nature. They often say that those who commit wrongdoing should take punishment equal and proportionately to their actions. This was the mentality of dungeons. The Lord felt that the person hurt him or threatened his seat of power and therefore needed to receive a punishment. So as you can see, these are horrible places created for the sole purpose of hiding people and breaking them. I'd like to contrast this brutal and savage example with something slightly more humane, monastery cells. Around the 14th century, the Roman Catholic Church had a very extensive domain, reaching into various countries. In England alone, there were around 420 monasteries. King Henry VIII ended the relationship with the church. A common practice during this time was people pleading benefit of clergy, which allowed them to go through the legal process in the ecclesiastical court, which forbid the use of the death sentence as opposed to the judicial court. So we have a large amount of people in the monasteries, all from different backgrounds, hometowns, and lives. These were different types of people with different personalities. There were often arguments, and the most common punishment was being sent to the monk's cell or room. The cells are only similar to dungeons by name. Cells in monasteries were oftentimes the clergy's own room. These rooms were rooms that the clergy and domestic workers were confined to, and they were not meant to be prison cells, but simply areas to reflect and pray. Later on, when the cells in the monasteries were overflowing, certain chapels created entire areas and rooms that were to be used for the excess amount of people. The use of sending them to the rooms was not meant to be a wretched or physically torturous process, but was meant to be a time of rehabilitation. Those who were told to stay in the rooms did so that they could be an active member of their community by praying and thinking about what they've done. Monasteries were complex and complicated structures. They were different types of people, personalities, viewpoints, wants, and needs. This led to fights and oftentimes murder. Both clergy members and domestic workers were all sent to their cell as punishment. This was not an extrajudicial process because detailed records were kept of who was sentenced to what. As we can see, rehabilitation in this context is much more humane than retributivism and incapacitation. Rehabilitation serves to help the person heal, but there's one thing that's wrong with rehabilitation, and that's that it assumes that there's something wrong with the person in the first place, and they need to be fixed. For this reason, this is why I would like to see society respond to wrongdoing with restorative justice. Restorative justice is not revengeful or punitive, but is a way to look at the problem and discuss how to improve the situation in the future, when it inevitably happens again, because humans make mistakes. Mistakes are inevitable, but society doesn't have healthy structures in place to deal with these mistakes in the future. Restorative justice is a conversation that not only invokes the people that were hurt, but the people who did the harm as well as the people who were impacted by the event as well. It gathers everyone and creates a dialogue about what happened, what went wrong, how it should be addressed, and how they should go about it in the future. As you can see, we've taken aspects from both examples. The dungeons were a bad example and proved to show what we should not do. And rehabilitation was an okay to good example and had certain aspects that we could use. And so by taking both of these, this is how I arrived at restorative justice. What I like about this approach is that it refuses to break and lower the person who committed the crime, but instead attempts to help everyone and raise everyone up. In many ways, this is the best solution because there's an understanding that this crime is trying to be prevented by analyzing the root of the problem. One of the problems with rehabilitation was that it is an internal process and there's no real way of knowing if it worked or not. But with restorative justice and its communal approach, it is able to not only address the problem, but create a structure and a system that will help deal with it and prevent the situation in the future. Thank you.